We get asked about banking in Singapore quite a bit, and that's because it's one of the most stable and well-managed banking hubs in the world, which means a lot of people talk about Singapore banking. They also talk about the benefits of banking in Singapore and the Singapore banks themselves. But there is a big problem. It's super difficult to open accounts in Singapore, especially if you're a foreigner with no ties to the country. So most people, they either give up on banking here in the first place, or they waste thousands of dollars flying to Singapore to try and open accounts just to get rejected. But it doesn't have to be this way. So in this video, I'm going to share the 3 most important hurdles that you will need to overcome if you want to open a Singapore bank account successfully. I'll also share the 8 key variables that Singapore banks look at when reviewing applications, and I'm even going to tell you how to go about opening a Singapore bank account today, for free from wherever you are in the world. And to wrap things up, I'm also going to be telling you which Singapore banks I think are best for foreigners right now. So let's get started by taking a look at the variables that Singapore banks consider in the application phase. And then I'm going to tell you the 3 hurdles that you will need to overcome to successfully open. Now, like banks in a lot of countries, Singapore banks, they also look at the basics. That means citizenship, residency, local ties to the country, your deposit amount, account activity, and source of income and source of wealth. And you also need to consider how you want to go about opening the account, meaning in person, remote, or through a qualified introduction. Depending on your profile, you might qualify to open accounts at every single bank in Singapore, or you might not qualify to open at any bank in Singapore. It really just depends on how your application stacks up during the review process. And yes, like I said, these are the same factors that you're basically going to have to consider when banking anywhere else in the world. But Singapore banks have specific restrictions that other countries don't have. And these restrictions are tied to where you live, what you do, how much money you have, and why you want to bank in Singapore in the first place. And there's even some consideration for where you can prove local ties. Now, Singapore banks, they obviously put a stronger weighting on certain variables while others are less important. And what we're seeing is that more and more people are being turned away by Singapore banks for 3 variables in particular. And no surprise, these are the 3 hurdles that you will have to overcome if you want to open a Singapore bank account. Because if you can't overcome these 3 hurdles, you're not going to qualify to bank in Singapore. Now, quick sidebar here, our team, we have helped thousands of people and businesses solve cross-border banking problems, including opening accounts in Singapore remotely, so we know the sort of profiles that banks are willing to accept and those that they will commonly reject. And your ability to overcome these 3 hurdles, it will make or break your application in Singapore. And they include having residency in a qualifying country, being able to make a qualifying deposit, and having an acceptable source of income or wealth. So let's talk about these 3 hurdles, starting with residency. Now, I have talked about how residency influences account opening in Singapore in the past, and in these past videos, I've talked about whitelisted residency, restricted residency, and blacklisted residency. But I want to take it a step further and help you better understand who can and cannot bank in Singapore. So here's how you should look at this. First, the most obvious acceptable residency is Singapore. No surprise here. If you reside in Singapore, regardless of your citizenship, you should have no problem opening bank accounts. Next, residency in neighboring countries. These countries fall into that whitelisted category that I just mentioned. Basically, this means you can open accounts at most banks in Singapore, including both Singaporean banks and foreign banks. More on that in a little bit. Now, the final group of people that can unlock Singapore banks have residency in other qualifying countries, obviously. But this group is not as straightforward or easy to understand because it includes different countries from across Asia, parts of Europe, and certain Middle Eastern countries, as well as parts of Latin America. And of course, each bank will have its own preferences and restrictions when it comes to who they're willing to accept. So while certain residencies in Europe or Latin America, for example, might not be able to open at all banks in Singapore, they can still access Singaporean bank accounts at certain banks. It can be a bit confusing, and if you don't know which banks are willing to accept your profile, including your country of residence, then you can end up wasting a ton of time and money applying to the wrong banks. So, quick recap, people who live in Singapore, surrounding parts of Asia, and certain developing countries in Europe, Latin America, and even parts of the Middle East can open accounts in Singapore. But what about the countries that cannot bank in Singapore? What we're talking about here are Western countries and underdeveloped countries, along with gray-listed and blacklisted countries. And for the purpose of this video, we're going to call these restricted countries. And basically, if you live in one of these restricted countries, there's a strong chance that you are not going to be able to open a bank account in Singapore. But again, we're talking about residency, so the country that you live in, not your country of citizenship. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, beyond the obvious sanctioned and otherwise blacklisted countries, it means that if you live in a country like the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Canada, Australia, and other similar Western nations, Singapore banks are going to have a very hard time accepting your application. And the big reason for this is that you're restricted in terms of account activity. Basically, Singapore banks can't sell you any products or services, so they can't make any money off of you as a client. So they'd rather focus on Asian residents or residents of other qualifying countries where they don't have complicated regulations and reporting requirements they need to abide by. And that's because residents in these unrestricted countries can invest. They can use other services offered by the bank. So the bank can profit off of the relationship, which makes it a win-win. Of course, having the right residency isn't enough. You also need to have enough money. Now, the amount of money that you need to deposit with a Singaporean bank, it largely depends on two factors. First, your residency, and second, the type of account that you want to open. So, residency. What we're talking about here is whether you live in Singapore or not. If you live in Singapore, you can basically open local accounts with any bank in the country at basically zero deposit level. Pretty straightforward, but if you live outside of Singapore, it's a different situation. In that case, you'll almost always need to open a premier bank account, meaning not a low-level retail account. And these premier accounts, they do have minimum deposit requirements that you will need to meet. In US dollar terms, these deposits, they can range between $135,000 to $250,000, depending on the bank and the specific account that you want to apply for. But that's just premier banking. Like I said, how much you need to deposit also depends on the type of account that you want to open. And in addition to premier banking, foreign non-residents can also open private bank accounts in Singapore. And needless to say, private bank accounts, they do have higher minimum requirements, which we typically refer to as total relationship balance. Now, the amount that you need to deposit is going to depend on the profile of the individual opening the account, as well as a number of different variables. But generally speaking, to open private bank accounts in Singapore, you will need to deposit between $1 million and $5 million. Again, this is in US dollar terms, but this is just the minimum. We've helped a lot of people open accounts in Singapore at the private banking level, and in most cases, they're coming in above this threshold. So, quick recap. If you're a Singapore resident, you can open with basically any bank at a zero deposit. And if you're not a Singapore resident, you'll typically need to deposit at least $135,000 up to $250,000 to access premier banking, or $1 million up to $5 million if you want to access private banking. Those are the minimums. Of course, money isn't everything. You still need to have the right source of income and source of wealth for Singapore banks to want you as a client in the first place. So what does this mean? Well, source of income and source of wealth are terms that basically ask the question, where does your money come from? And how you answer this can seriously affect your chances of opening bank accounts. This is true in Singapore as well as basically any country in the world. Now, unfortunately, most people, they don't think enough about their answer before they respond to this question. And that often leads to applications being rejected. But after looking at thousands of cases, I can tell you with certainty that this is one of the most consistently screwed up parts of an application when opening bank accounts. So how do you make sure that you don't screw it up? Well, there are 5 things that you should know. First, communicate clearly. Second, don't leave any room for uncertainty. Third, talk about your activities, not third-party activities. Fourth, be prepared to provide examples. And fifth, be prepared to provide supporting documents. That's it. Most of these are self-explanatory, and if you can tick these boxes, you should be good in terms of explaining your source of income or wealth to the bank in order to get an account approved. But I do want to dig into the third point here because I think it needs a bit more explanation, and that is not talking about third-party activities. Talk about your own activities. Now, quick example here. Let's say you're an entrepreneur. You've decided that you want to open a personal or private bank account in Singapore. Doesn't matter which account. And when the bank asks you to explain what you do for work or what is your source of wealth, you say that you own a business, a consulting firm, and it offers services to a number of different clients. But let's say 85% of your clients, they happen to be in the cryptocurrency industry. Now, you don't own a crypto company, but we see a lot of entrepreneurs in this sort of situation overcomplicating their business activities and making their source of income appear significantly more complex than it actually is. And that usually sounds something like, I own a cryptocurrency company. We're one of the leading consultants to major crypto companies all around the world. Basically, they overemphasize their ties to the industry or another high-risk industry when they're actually just a consulting, recruitment, or even a web design company. And what does the bank do? They reject the application because it's easier for them to reject an application when someone has potentially high risk or complex income than it is for them to dig into the details and try and determine if this could be a good fit for the bank. Now, there's obviously going to be a lot of nuance to this, and it does depend on the specific activities, industry, and even the individuals involved. And that brings up a really good point. there are activities and industries that are classified as high risk, restricted, and even prohibited. This is true in any country. But in Singapore, the most common activities that we see banks shying away from, they include the standard ones that you'd probably expect. Think adult entertainment, e-gaming, online gambling, cryptocurrency trading, money service businesses, jewelry and precious metals, tobacco, alcohol products, and basically anything else that sounds illegal or heavily regulated, like arms dealing, pharmaceuticals, etc., etc. So if you are earning income from any of these industries, then you will struggle to bank in Singapore. Though you probably already know that, because if you're involved in any of these industries, you're also going to be struggling to bank anywhere else in the first place. And that's tough. We see it all the time. So if that's you, here's what you can do. Go to globalbanks.com/apply, fill out a free assessment. Our team will review your information and tell you if you have any chance of opening reputable bank accounts in reputable jurisdictions, Singapore or anywhere else. But if you're not in a high-risk industry or have a high-risk profile, you'll have a much better chance at opening accounts. So if that's you, non-high risk, let's dig into how you can open accounts in Singapore remotely on your own. You'll obviously need to choose which bank you want to apply to, and I am going to share my favorite banks in Singapore with you in a minute, but you're also going to need to prepare to meet a few requirements, supply qualifying documents, and overcome a few hurdles. And before you say, yeah, I know this, it's worth listening to make sure you don't miss anything, because the last thing that you want to do is apply for an account and get rejected based on a technicality that you could have otherwise avoided. So, requirements. Most banks in Singapore, they will ask you to provide the basics. Think your passport, proof of residential address, meaning a utility bill is most common here. And it's important to note that most Singapore banks, they're not going to accept any sort of lease agreement. Also, the address you choose is important because Singapore banks, they don't want to see a CMRA, no mail forwarders, PO boxes, or other commercial service providers. And you'll also need to provide proof of tax residency, which can include residence permit or any government issued letter with your full legal name on it. Of course, you do need to provide your tax identification number as well from your country of tax residence, and you need to supply your proof of employment, though this obviously is going to differ depending on your profile and whether you're coming in at premier or private banking level. If you're coming in at the private banking level, you may be asked for source of wealth instead, which will differ depending on how you made your money. Now, restrictions. As I've said, certain countries of residence are not going to be able to bank in Singapore. And the big ones here are the Western countries that we've already discussed. Think US, Canada, UK, basically every EU country, and certain gray-listed and blacklisted countries as well. In fact, even countries that have recently been removed from gray lists or blacklists are still going to struggle to bank here as well. And what this ultimately means for the residents of these countries is that they should be looking to bank somewhere else instead. Now, there are also citizenship-based restrictions, and if you're an American, Canadian, Brit, or EU citizen, these citizenship-based restrictions are relevant to you. Basically, unless you actually live in Singapore or a neighboring country, you are going to have a very hard time opening an account in Singapore if you are a citizen of these countries. And even if you do, there's a very good chance that you're still going to face restrictions. And that means you're not going to be able to invest, access bank services, or products that the bank is willing to offer, which means that you're basically going to end up with a very high deposit savings account with a minimum deposit of around $135,000. Which doesn't make a lot of sense, though you would end up banking with some of the best banks available anywhere in the world. But if that's you, you should probably look at other options first so that you can find the best bank that matches your profile with bankers and banks that are willing to offer you the services that you might be looking for. Now, for everyone else, let's start looking at Singapore banks. And I said I was going to share my favorite Singapore banks for foreigners, and I'm going to do that right now. But before I do, since you have made it this far in the video, if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, please do so. That way we know we should keep making more videos like this for you going forward. Okay, banks. Now there are two types of banks that foreign non-residents should be considering in Singapore. First up are Singapore banks. Now, most people will tell you it's impossible to open accounts with Singapore banks as a foreign non-resident. But as we've already discussed in this video, that's not true. You just need to overcome the 3 hurdles that we've already mentioned: residency, deposit, and source of income and wealth. And the second type of bank that you can consider, they're the foreign banks. Now here, I'm talking about banks that are registered to operate in Singapore and have offices in Singapore, often very large offices that cater to high net worth individuals in the region. These banks are from countries like Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Hong Kong, France, Australia, and even the United States. Now, in terms of which banks are best for foreign non-residents, there's obviously going to be some nuance to this, but I'm not going to leave you hanging. I am going to give you real examples. In the Singapore list, it's pretty straightforward because there's only so many banks to choose from, and when it comes to opening as a foreign non-resident, there's even fewer options. And they include DBS, OCBC, and UOB. I'll also add the Bank of Singapore to this list since technically it's a standalone bank, but it's basically the private banking arm of OCBC. And I'm not going to say which of these banks is better than the others because frankly, they're all very good options and each of them does have something different to offer to different client profiles. But what about the foreign banks? Well, here it's a bit more difficult to compare, and it does depend quite a bit on the person applying. But in most cases, these foreign banks, they're designated for premier and private banking, which means the minimum deposits, they're going to be higher. Now, if you do go the private banking route, the onboarding teams, they can be a bit more flexible. So if you have a tough to bank profile, think something like complex source of wealth, some of these foreign banks, especially the Swiss banks, they may consider still onboarding you as a client. So who comes out on top in terms of foreign banks in Singapore? Well, there are a few names that we like, including Julius Baer, Lombard Odier, and even UBS, if you're coming in at a higher relationship balance. But again, these foreign banks and the others that are on the ground in Singapore, they're looking for private banking and wealth management clients, high net worth individuals. So that means larger deposits and an expectation that you'll be investing. On the other hand, if you are considering one of the Singaporean banking options, you can either do premier or private banking. So all things considered, if you can overcome the 3 main hurdles that I shared earlier in the video, you'll have plenty of options to choose from when looking to open bank accounts in Singapore. And that brings me to the final thing that I want to talk to you about, which is whether you can actually qualify to open a Singapore bank account. Now, I know I just went through the hurdles and the qualifications and the different documents you're going to need to provide, but knowing for a fact whether or not you can qualify is a totally different thing. So how can you tell if you actually qualify? That's the question. And I'm going to help you find out for free right now. If you really want to open a bank account in Singapore, you can complete a free assessment. It takes 2.5 minutes to fill out, and our team will review it and get back to you with a confirmation on whether you'll be able to bank in Singapore or not. And if the answer is no, we'll even suggest a few alternative jurisdictions that you might want to consider instead with similar banks in similar jurisdictions. That easy. You just fill out the form and we'll get back to you within 24 hours with an answer. Just go to globalbanks.com/apply or click the link in the description below. And obviously there's zero obligation to use our services or ever talk to us again. Instead, we'll tell you whether you can qualify or not, and then you can go ahead and use all the information that I've just shared in this video to navigate the entire process on your own. Though if you want our team of banking experts to help you, we can obviously do that too. So go ahead, click the link below to fill out your assessment now, and our team will get back to you as soon as possible with an answer. And after you do, make sure you watch this video over here on why you should never bank in Switzerland. The answers, they might surprise you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.